So, yes, this whole idea for a show began with the notion of nowhere. Specifically, John Herman, writing in New York Magazine almost exactly a year ago, said that this election was going to take place nowhere and nowhere at all. And what he was referring to is kind of the collapse of conventional or legacy media, the failure of it to be replaced by anything else. I think he was also talking about the general sense of malaise and numbness that existed last July, kind of feeling like we've done this before. And these guys are really old. So things have changed a little bit. You might have noticed. And we're still asking that question. Where is this election taking place right now? Here to get us started. And a little bit later, we're going to talk specifically about TikTok and specifically about podcasts. But here to give us kind of an overview and begin this conversation, one of our favorite guests from the past, Danagal Young is director of the Center for Political Communication and a professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware. Her newest book is Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. Dana, welcome back to our show.
Thanks, Colin. It's great to be back.
So maybe we can even just start with the present moment, like the really present moment today. No, actually, before we do that, let's just say something else, which is, when John Herman was writing that piece, it was last July. Things really have become different. There isn't that kind of numbness that was affecting large sectors of the potential electorate. People are saying this election doesn't really mean anything to me. That, I think you would say, has changed in the last few weeks.
Yeah, the last few weeks have really, I think, transformed this election in interesting ways. I think both for Republicans and for Democrats. I mean, the assassination attempt on, the former president was horrifying for all of us to witness. And I think the notion that we had people from both political parties condemning that act and saying that that's anti-democratic, that's not how we do things. I think that was a real moment for the political establishment to remind us that even though it seems like we're always against each other, there are certain things that we all agree are out of bounds. That's a pretty low bar, but at least it's something. And then with Biden dropping out of the race, I think the injection of energy from Democrats and even from young people who might not necessarily be super politically interested, that I think has changed things. So where we were at about a year ago, where we were at even a month ago, I think is different from where we are right now.
So it still feels to me, though, like a baseball game that's being played with no rules, no umpire. There's just kind of just general assertions being made by various people about what's happening on the field. And now I will start with the present day. So one of the things that's emerged over the last maybe 36 hours, that's how we measure things now. It's like not weeks or months, it's just hours.
36 minutes.
Yeah, 36 minutes. But so Trump at the National Association of Black Journalists suddenly blurted out this whole thing about how Kamala Harris had previously identified as black, and now she's identifying as Indian, and she can't possibly be both, which, of course, she can and she is. And that kind of erupted several different kinds of geysers around social media. And I want to tell this story on myself because it's a great example of how even somebody who's thinking hard about this, which I hope I'm doing, can get caught. So I saw something on X today. It's got a Kamala Harris with a check mark next to it. I didn't look at it too carefully after that. And it says, growing up, my mom made Punjab chole and my dad made collard greens, while Donald Trump's dad made sure black people couldn't rent his apartments, parentheses, yes, really close parentheses. And I reposted that. I said, okay, that's what counterpunching looks like. And then somebody gently pointed out to me that down at the bottom, there's something about parody by somebody. This was not actually a Kamala Harris statement, but it could have been. And I think that's a reality that we're living in right now, is that we don't exactly always know where information comes from, let alone, Dana, whether it's true or not.
Right. I love that. It's not true, but it could have been. And I think that is where we have found ourselves. And that is, it's really challenging because I think that's what many of us say to ourselves when we do find ourselves in that situation where we're sharing something or believing something that's untrue. And we realize that it's actually empirically false. And perhaps a darker example is when I saw the initial post, I believe it was on Twitter, from the young person who made up the claim about J.D. Vance having some kind of relationship with his sofa. And I read the book Hillbilly Elegy, and I thought that I read it fairly closely. And I saw a tweet basically saying, okay, so we're going to just ignore the fact that this vice presidential candidate confesses to having had, sex with his sofa on these pages of his memoir. And I thought for a second, I don't remember that part. But maybe, I mean, is it plausible? There was a lot of stuff in that book, Colin. There was a lot of, it was a dark past. He had a challenging upbringing. What do I know? Maybe it was in there. Now, I didn't post it or share it because I wasn't sure, but it was in my mind then. Maybe it was in there. And then over time, I see that entire claim was completely spurious, completely false. It had all the markers of truth because it even had the page numbers in there. But I had fallen into that same trap. It's like, well, it seems like maybe it could have been true. So maybe it was true. We are running into those instances more and more, mainly because our relationship to our political environment, especially for those of us who are politically interested, is more and more emotional, more and more tied to our identity and core aspects of self. And when we're emotional and our identities are involved or threatened, we're going to operate quickly to make meaning and make ourselves feel good. And that is sometimes going to mean believing things that are fiction.
Yeah, I loved everything that you just said, especially the thing about how he had a certain relationship with his couch. But we'll set that aside for a second. And it was so delicately worded. But yeah, so, I mean, I think one of the things that you're suggesting too is that increasingly, I mean, elections always run to a certain degree on visceral content, on things that activate the limbic system, the part of us that makes a snake bite you when you step on it. And I mean, that's always the case, but it seems to be more true now. So even that whole thing about Trump saying that, somehow or other she can't be Indian and black at the same time. And I mean, the White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre immediately said that was repulsive and insulting. And you see this cycle that begins. It's not, we're not going to go through this in some kind of Eric Severide, intellectual dissection of what's being said. It seems it's much more at the level of viscera.
And what happens is these moments, maybe like that statement from Trump, it feels so morally offensive for people in many cultural and political spaces to even have had to hear that statement uttered. And when you have something that's morally offensive tied to identity, which is what that checked all the boxes there, right?
Yeah.
It activates a sense of identity threat that causes us to act. And we act in service of our own sense of our team and what we know to be true and good and right and just. And we want to stand up for that because when our team is under threat, that is how we defend ourselves. And what I think is really interesting is when you look at some of the literature on why group identity and group identity activation is so powerful. There are folks who work in the space of evolutionary psychology who suggest that it really is quite intuitive that it affects us in this way because back in the day, as I like to call it, right? Back in the day, there were hostile coalitions of outgroups who we would encounter all the time as we were, hunting and gathering. And you would need to instantly engage in some kind of collective action with your team in order to ward off the threat from those hostile coalitions of outgroup members. And so it really is it's a very quick way of mobilizing collective behavior, and groups are really difficult to coordinate. It's like, I don't know if you've ever seen kids playing soccer. It's like, it's right. A bit of a disaster, right? Like they're all over the place. But that is the collective action problem. We're all kids playing soccer, but if you activate identity threat, we get in line real quick.
Yeah, and I think, that identity, as you're suggesting, becomes more important than almost anything else. And so when I'm not getting taken in by, cute internet hoaxes, I occasionally try to talk to people about ones that they've been taken in by. And so there are a couple of conservative places on Facebook that I monitor. And So, for example, somebody put up this picture. It's of Pete Buttigieg, and he's got. It's a fake picture. I should just say that right away. It's a fake picture. It's photoshopped or altered somehow. He's wearing what's called, I think, a chest feeding device, where you can feed a baby. You have this breastplate strapped to you, and you're feeding a baby the way that a mother might nurse a baby. And I just put on a Reuters fact check link, and I said this just is not true. And somebody in the group said, "Well, it's disgusting anyway." know? And it's kind of like the group has already decided about this. The question of whether it's factual or not, whether it's a complete fake, is less interesting than the role it plays in further cementing or enlarging or enraging, Dana, that group identity.
Yeah, and think about how powerful that post is. It's disgusting anyway.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a wonderful book called Frenemies by Jamie Settle, who's at William and Mary, and she has all of this data illustrating how social media activate really a unique combination of news, expression, and engagement. And it can be invigorating and help with grassroots organizing, but it also has these pretty devastating democratic effects, anti-democratic effects, because what we tend to be doing in these spaces is engaging in performances of identity. We're expressing ourselves to sort of show our flag and say, look, I'm a good team member. Look at me. I'm a good member of my team. And in fact, that's the content that goes viral, moral and emotional content that says what should and should not be happening and does so in an emotional way. That's the content that is really going to take off right away and get a lot of clicks and be rewarded by the algorithm. And that is content that's identity based. So we're all out there trying to look around and say, what are the cues that tell me how good members of my team respond to this moment? And that person on your feed said, even if it's not true, it's disgusting anyway. And it's like, this is how people like us are going to respond to a stimulus like this. And we're always looking in our information environment to get cues of how do people like me, how do good members of my team behave now? What do we say? What do we do? What jokes do we make? And we're all engaging in it.
One of the things that sort of recurs as a theme when we talk about media and politics is that certain politicians seem to master a medium more than other people and maybe ahead of other people. FDR mastered radio. JFK and Ronald Reagan mastered TV in a way that few other politicians ever did. Trump really mastered Twitter until he got kicked off of it. I mean, he really made political discourse happen on Twitter in real time. Barack Obama was probably the first truly internet president with a lot of user-generated content like Obama Girl on YouTube. Kamala Harris seems, at the moment anyway, very TikTokable. I don't know. What is your thinking about that? Do you think that there is, even now, a dominant media that's worth being the best at?
Well, I think a lot of us who operate in this space, who study politics and media or are interested in it, we are always interested in the shiny new objects,
Mm-hmm.
right? So we're always like, oh, oh, look at how Kamala is doing over on TikTok, and she has all these young people who are brat and coconut, and there's all these memes and expressions and that all or enthymemes, they hold meaning, they have big meaning behind them, and if you don't know it, you got to look it up and figure out what it is. So all of that's fun and great, but I think that that also ignores some of these staples, these spaces that have existed, still exist, and are still very influential in the political space. And whether that be legacy media like legacy newspapers, often setting the agenda for other outlets. A lot of the things that we see on social media are responding to stories that have been investigated and broken by the legacy press. Not always, but often. And things as simple as local television news, which is still such an important staple. Now, it is the amount that people rely on it is going down, according to Pew, but it still shines as a place where people are going to go for local information. And it shines as a place where people are going to encounter campaign information that is made relevant to them based on their community. So whether candidates go to the nearby city or town, and then that's covered through their local station, or the election itself is covered it through a sort of local community lens and then translate it to them in ways that matter to them, that's still an important thing. And I think that we ignore it at our own peril because it's out there and it's very popular with a whole lot of folks. So TikTok is fun, and but local television news is still a player.
I think it's also, I mean, something that's no longer a bright, shiny object is Facebook. But I think Facebook is still incredibly potent. Clay Shirky says what Facebook's really good at is helping people find each other. So if you want to form one of these communities where you think that Kamala Harris is a horrible, morally loose person, or if you want to form a community or find a whole lot of other people who think Trump is weird, you can do that really well on Facebook. I actually think, despite the fact that Elon Musk owns Twitter and he's a Trump supporter and stuff, I think Twitter's actually a little bit better than it has any right to be. I think you can function pretty well on Twitter and get your message out, even if it isn't, the sort of ordained truth of Elon. But to me, I find some of the more pernicious circulating content to be happening on boring old Facebook.
Yeah, I think you're not wrong, but what's interesting is the extent to which Facebook has demoted news and public affairs content through
Yes.
their algorithm. I mean, anytime I try to share something that's a news story, I'm like, wow, people really don't want to respond to this. And then I realize, oh, actually, no one saw it.
Mm.
That is a deliberate effort on their part. And Facebook has said they've really changed their tune, by the way, because just a few years ago they were saying, oh, people really want local news and journalism through the platform. And then they turned around, they were like, actually, no, they don't. They don't want that at all. So the reason that we don't encounter that kind of stuff is because it really is demoted by the algorithm, which I think is part of their attempt to minimize the amount of political divisiveness that's on the platform. But I think that when you are also demoting investigative, credible reporting, I think that's a problem. On Twitter, you can carve out enclaves where you have trusted individuals and sources who are still there, who you can follow. I worry more, though, Colin, about the folks who are not as able to distinguish between credible and non-credible sources. The fact, for example, that at the top of the hour, when you mentioned that there had been a check mark next to the Kamala Harris X account that posted this thing that you thought was real, the notion that verification is a pay-to-play system and no longer is indicative of a credible, real entity has been devastating from the jump. I mean, it started out as people using these, creating accounts and paying for verification to pretend they were people that they weren't, just to make a point about how ludicrous it is. But it's still ludicrous. I mean, now I feel like I engage in the opposite kind of heuristic where when I see a check mark, that's when I put my suspicious hat on. It's not supposed to be like that, right? But on Elon's Twitter, it is. And a couple things are going on over at X that I think are really important. Number one, you have an owner who is a self-proclaimed free speech advocate who is like, everything, it's kind of the Wild West, everything, it's fair play out here. And yet he's also kind of systematically violating his platform's own terms of service, like he did the other day by sharing an AI manipulated video of Kamala Harris where she seemed to be saying things that she wasn't actually saying, and the parody tag had been removed. So that would be a violation of the terms of service of X, and he did it anyway, and spreading conspiracy theories, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Twitter right off the bat, I think they fired about,
Oh, yeah.
their entire trust and safety team.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like 7,000 individuals. And then they hired some back, and it's a tricky place if you're someone that doesn't know how to vet credible sources and take a beat before you like or share things.
Okay, we've only got about 3 minutes left, and this is a 40-minute conversation, and I know that because we've had this 40-minute conversation before. But there's one place we haven't talked about that I think is important in kind of cementing various ideas about people, and let's just give you an example of it, because we're going to hear a lot more of this kind of thing and see a lot more of this kind of thing this fall. Bradley, could you play A1, please?
Why, that's Joe Biden. How are you, Joe Biden?
Hey there, folks.
How are you?
Hey, did y'all catch my press conference? It was so easy. A lot of critics thought I wasn't mentally prepared enough, but I think I proved them all wrong. Yeah. Oh, Kamala, not sure if you heard, but I'm putting you in charge of solving a little immigration problem down at the Mexican border.
Yes, I did hear that. Wow. Thank you for the opportunity. Such a fun, solvable problem.
Okay, that, of course, is Maya Rudolph playing Kamala Harris, which she's done in the past. Obviously, we're going to see a lot more of her this fall. She won't be talking so much about Joe Biden. But Dana, this is a sphere that you've written a lot about and you know a lot about. And we should say that, the whole J.D. Vance couch thing just thrived on late night television, even though they knew it wasn't true.
Yeah.
It thrived anyway. Anyway, we got maybe about 90 seconds left to talk about that, which is not enough for you. But say whatever you want to say.
Well, I love the fact that now we have the late night comedy world kind of intersecting with the online funny meme world in ways that are really reciprocated. I think that to me is hilarious because it started online and now it's turned into a punchline on the main network jokes. That's a concept we call intertextuality, which is when different sources of information interact with one another. And when we receive those messages, we're not just affected by one particular message, we're affected by the way that those messages intersect in the informational environment, which is so cool. Late night also, and satire in general, plays a really important role in bringing things to the top of our mind. That's probably, they're not actually great in persuading us to have a certain attitude or belief. That's not what they're great at. They're great at setting our agenda, getting us to think about things, bringing things up that then we're like, I don't know what that is about. I need to look that up. That's an excellent sort of use of satire in late night. I'd also say that when you're talking about the more long form satire shows like The Daily Show, we've also seen what I think is most important in this election is the use of satire as a way to explain and highlight what authoritarianism is, why it's dangerous, and what is at stake in the context of a democratic election.
Oh, yeah. John Oliver does explanatory journalism. We have to stop there. I hate that we have to stop here. I enjoy you so much. Danica Young is director of the Center for Political Communication and professor of communication and political science at the University of Delaware. Her newest book is Wrong: How Media, Politics, and Identity Drive Our Appetite for Misinformation. Thanks, Dana. We'll talk to you again really soon. We're going to take a break right now, and then we're going to talk.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you. We're going to talk about the TikTok after this.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree? You exist in the context of all in which you live and what came before you.
So that simple clip has turned into an incredibly viral sensation on TikTok. One of the ways in which, well, actually, let me just bring aboard our guest. First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about TikTok here, or maybe a lot about it. Christian Paz is senior politics reporter for Vox. So, Christian, the wisdom in campaigns, I've been covering them for a really long time, is, typically it's just sort of a war of two sets of ideas. I'm running against you. I want to convince the world that I'm a knight in shining armor, and you're kind of a lowlife. You're running a campaign against me. You're basically trying to get the same message across. But we live now in an era of organically generated, spontaneously happening content. And TikTok, maybe because the bar is pretty low, you can get a TikTok up very easily, has become just a bumper crop situation for that. So what do you see happening here recently as TikTok became a little bit more politically engaged?
Yeah, that's such a good point. I think the role of TikTok has really evolved since the first election where it was, being used by people. I think it's easy to forget that 2020 pandemic was the key to, people being locked up meant that they turned online and TikTok's usage exploded. But this is the first election where we're actually kind of not existing in kind of the pandemic bubble that we did in 2020. And what we're seeing with TikTok is it's really become a bit of a sandbox almost for young people and even other cohorts now as it's growing to essentially use it as a way to express speech, to engage in debates, and to use it essentially as a public square in a way that it wasn't being used as much in 2020. In 2020, it was very, very like entertainment and trend and pandemic, right, focused. And this time around, what we're seeing with TikTok is um, it's a place where uh, millions of people are having conversations that sometimes are a little bit different from the ones that the rest of us are having if we're not TikTok users on other social media platforms or in mainstream media. And that's something that's really, really interesting to me right now.
Yeah. So, and I think first of all, there are people who lend themselves unintentionally, just by their nature, to certain kinds of media manipulation. I remember in 2008, and really maybe the 4 or 8 years that followed, the Gregory brothers, who kind of famously did Auto-Tune the News or Songify This. It just turned out to be really fun to make Joe Biden sing. He wasn't president or anything like that, but just to take him and auto-tune his voice so it seemed like he was singing. They did it with everybody, but it just worked really well with Biden for some reason that I think we would find hard to explain. There's something about Kamala Harris and the way that she laughs and the way that she dances and stuff that in a very positive way seems to work on TikTok. But what's your take? Like, why would that be the case?
Yeah, it's so true because I think it's like a combination of things. I think with TikTok specifically, it's how young the user base is.
Mm-hmm.
It's disproportionately young relative to the other apps that we're all used to using. And a lot of these folks don't have that long of a political memory, so they don't necessarily know Kamala Harris that well. A lot of them are being introduced to her through these memes, through these trends. The same is true with young folks who use Twitter in a way. And there's like a little bit of overlap here where folks are rediscovering, younger people are rediscovering that she was attorney general, that she was a district attorney, that she was, some of the funny moments during her Senate races. And so it's kind of a combination of, she is personable, she is young compared to what we were all used to seeing in terms of Trump and Biden. There are a lot of just kind of funny moments that happen where she's around. I can think very clearly of the 2016 Senate debate that she had with Loretta Sanchez, a California representative, where Sanchez did a dab on stage, and Harris's reaction, at the time, went viral, and it's kind of having a second life on TikTok, and similarly with a clip, for example, that was on Twitter that made its way onto TikTok of then Attorney General Harris or Attorney General-elect Harris asking a clerk in Los Angeles to begin to issue same-sex marriage licenses after Prop 8 was overturned. And that is kind of, I think it's like an element of curiosity of folks kind of realizing, oh, wait, she's been around. Why haven't we seen her? What has she been up to? What has she been doing? And a lot of this kind of interplays a little bit with folks who've been around a little bit longer who are like, oh, well, she has been doing all of this. Wait until you see this. Wait until you see that. And so it's this kind of an overlap of the joy and relief, right, that some folks are feeling now that the election has changed so quickly. A little bit of a sense of folks not really knowing much about Harris, and a lot of those people being younger and approaching politics in general through the lens of humor and through the lens of parody. And that's partially why TikTok lends itself so much to those kinds of edits. And then it's also easy to edit, like you said. So it's easy to join in on this trend.
So, Christian, the $200 million question, and you've written about this, is if we imagine a Venn diagram and one circle contains people between the ages of 18 and 25 who spend 4 to 6 hours a day on TikTok, and then the other circle is people who are likely to vote in November. I think for a long time, our heuristic sense of this is that those circles might not overlap very much at all. But it has turned into a $200 million question. If, in fact, an enthusiasm gap is being closed, and we're watching the closure of that enthusiasm gap on TikTok, what does that mean in terms of tangible electoral results? Can you say a little bit about how you're thinking about that right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, I'm going to caveat all of this with it's still 100 days out from the election. But that's kind of the point, is there is just enough time to engage these younger folks who are consuming their news through TikTok, that are understanding and coming to form their opinions and views about the world through TikTok. I've written about this too, where it's interesting in a lot of the polling that I've taken a look at that asks the question of whether you're a TikTok user or not. If you're a younger TikTok user, your views are very different from the views of a young non-TikTok user. But that might be because younger TikTok users feel like they're more politically engaged, that they feel that they're more politically informed, that they feel like they're seeing information that other people aren't seeing. And that maybe they've used the algorithm to kind of craft a very specific kind of feed of information that they're consuming. When it was President Biden at the top of the ticket, that all meant disengagement, dissatisfaction, frustration, reinforcing of some of the negative perspectives that they had about the world, that they had about his administration, and essentially what we used to talk about the vibes being off, almost like the vibe session was one of those things that was talked about. It almost feels like the vibe session got like a massive stimulus right now, and what folks are seeing is hope, joy, inspiration, and a little bit of you know knowledge about a candidate that they can now make a decision on. They're being reintroduced to a Democratic candidate, and I think that's where the key comes in. That the campaign and a lot of these liberal groups that are boosting and supporting Vice President Harris's candidacy see this as a very unique opportunity to re-engage influencers, re-engage content creators, to provide briefings to some of those partners that they have, to take a pulse of, okay, if we can get folks to make a meme, would they be likely to sign up for a Zoom call? And if they sign up for a Zoom call, could we then persuade them to maybe sign up for a text or an email listserv or some kind of way to get in touch with them? If not, then can we at least get them to register to vote? And I think that's one of the things that we did see over the last week and a half is campaigns both organically and through kind of the Democratic Party systems, restarting some of their youth outreach, organizing young people, and also a boost through websites like vote.org, which saw a gigantic spike in new voter registrations in that first week after Vice President Harris stepped up and President Biden stepped off the ticket. And one of the interesting things to note was something like definitely something like 80%. I think I'm trying to remember the specific statistic. There was a pretty large number of those new registrants were under, were under, or what we would call like younger voters, so like 30 and under. And that it definitely represents an opportunity that they don't want to lose, that then they need to keep engaging, keep talking to. And the thing that Vice President Harris can do that President Biden couldn't was go everywhere, be everywhere, talk to the folks who are on TikTok, making TikToks. This week that meant Megan Thee Stallion and having 14 million views on one TikTok of her with Vice President Harris before that rally in Atlanta.
Yeah, and we only have about 3 minutes left here, but one thing that you've written about this week in a way that's not at all confined to TikTok is the notion of resistance or hashtag resistance that I think to the point that you just made, there was during the main part of this, the earlier part of this election, when it was Biden versus Trump, people who might have thought in terms of resistance were looking at it and saying, well, how are we going to resist that with this? This isn't a good enough resisting mechanism. That also, as you wrote, seems to have changed. There's a sense of, oh yeah, maybe resistance is a kind of Star Wars Rebel Alliance way to think about the present moment.
Right, and I have gotten some pushback since where I say, well, I'm not the one who coined resistance, right? This where they're saying, who's the incumbent right now? Who are we resisting? But I think what is interesting here is that there is kind of a picking up of the pieces almost of the last year and a half of these organizations. Many of them are younger, geared toward young voters, or are literally younger groups that did not exist during 2020 or during 2018. that have recently formed or have just begun to give endorsements, that they are seeing an uptick in requests to open chapters of their organizations on college campuses, of more folks signing up to volunteer or to work for them, of money pouring in again, of young people signing up and wanting to figure out how, not just how to vote, but how to convince others to vote and how to register other folks. So those are the elements that are kind of necessary too, independent of whatever the party does and whatever the candidate does. You need to have those organic grassroots kind of groups and organizations, these parts of civil society, to help reach these disengaged and kind of disconnected folks who, I think one of the stats that I'm always floored by is in 2023, Gallup found that it was young voters, 18 to 30, who were the least likely to say that they were following any kind of political news closely. And that was like very tiny relative to every other cohort. And it was like historically lower. Their average for the last 20 years before
it was 9%.
It was 9%.
That's unbelievable compared to an average of 16% in the last 20 years. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
So it was a big fall off. Christian, we have to stop there, but your work is terrific. We encourage people to seek it out. Christian Paz is senior politics reporter for Vox. We're going to take a little break. We're going to talk about the world of podcasting, and we have a little announcement at the end too. So stay with us. Our technical producer today is Bradley O'Connor. The senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show is Lily Tyson. She produced this episode. We're going to talk lastly about podcasts. We're going to do that with Derek Robertson, a writer, reporter, and producer at Politico, where he writes the Digital Future daily newsletter. In 2022, he wrote a piece called "Wow, Politicians Are Really Bad at Podcasting." Podcasting is probably a little bit like TikTok. You want other people to do it about you more than maybe you should want to do it. But Derek, first of all, welcome to our conversation.
Hi, thank you, Colin. I appreciate it.
Maybe we could just talk a little bit. You and I, it turns out, I think we listen to fairly different podcasts, but I listened to some of your podcasts today. But how does this moment feel to you in the world of podcasting as fuel, I guess, for the podcasters who do want to talk about this stuff?
To me, it feels very invigorating. I think that the way that podcasters have responded to the shakeup in the presidential election reflects the appeal of podcasts in the first place. You work in radio. I don't have to tell you, people respond differently and process information differently when they, hear it as opposed to reading it, whether it's reading it on a screen or on a piece of paper, if people still do that. The emotional tone of podcast conversations about the presidential election that I have been listening to has been just vastly different from the kind of turgid state of emotions across the ideological spectrum about a Biden-Trump rematch. Whether people are enthusiastic about the Kamala Harris candidacy or whether they are opposed to it, it has inspired very strong emotions and kind of injected some much needed emotional life into the character of this campaign that seemingly before this, nobody really wanted to face down that much.
I think also another thing that can happen with podcasts is you obviously get a very specific point of view. And sometimes if you make a kind of an affirmative effort, you can get a point of view that's different from your own. So because I know that you listen to it today, I was listening to Fifth Column, American Conservative Magazine's podcast, and they were just talking about something that I hadn't really thought about that much, which was that in Milwaukee at the Republican National Convention, one of them had just encountered I think it was one of those Tom Friedman, I talked to my Uber driver things, but the Uber driver was a young black man from North Milwaukee who said he was at a barbecue with about 30 people, only 3 of whom weren't Trump supporters. And the rest of them, these were people of color, and they thought Trump was a badass, and that he, shook off a grazing of his ear with a very dangerous bullet. And he fought the law and didn't entirely lose, but maybe experienced a little bit of what it's like to try to fight a well-organized law enforcement apparatus. And I just hadn't really heard that. And I think podcasts can do that, can expose you to, I'm not saying that's the gospel, but it is a point of view I don't have access to all that much.
Right. Yeah. I think because they are a sort of passive form of consumption. I mean, this is how I sort of process and curate the political podcasts I listen to. I don't feel, when I'm really digging into the weeds of, figuring out what's going on in the news, whether it's part of my daily work or whether it's just as a news consumer, I'm very particular and sort of conscious about what I choose to read because it feels like an active investment of time. Listening to podcasts is passive, and therefore I feel a little bit more eclectic with my listening habits, and that can lead to some kind of unexpected encounters, as you just described, which is always sort of edifying.
One thing that I do listen to a lot is Pod Save America, which is now part of Crooked Media, this kind of mini empire that they've built. I mean, at the center of it are 4 former Obama staffers, one or two of whom also had worked for Hillary Clinton. A lot of it has for a long time been, Casey Stengel famously said when he was managing the Mets, "Can't nobody here play this game?" And a lot of that has been these guys looking at the Biden campaign and saying, "Why aren't they saying this? Why aren't they messaging better?" And that to me is very interesting. It's interesting to hear political professionals talk about what they wish was happening. I don't know. Maybe you say a little bit about that too. I mean, one thing that helps them is they're very engaging. John Lovett is an extremely funny guy. If you're listening passively, you do want to be entertained by what you hear.
Yeah, I mean, the pod save phenomenon is really interesting in this context because, as you mentioned earlier in your introduction, I wrote a piece in 2022 where I sort of blitz listened to a bunch of podcasts by sitting or former politicians. And for the most part, they were quite bad. I mean, it is not in a politician's interest, unless you're sort of going the Bulworth route, which I think is always better in theory than it is in practice. It's not really in a politician's interest to be candid. So those podcasts fail for a very obvious reason. PodSave is very interesting because you have this group of guys who are clearly partisan. What their point of view is. That they're trying to persuade voters to get Democrats elected. And at the same time, they're extremely personable. And there's an authenticity that I think is bolstered by a few different things. They are willing to be self-deprecating. They've done, series about Democrats' shortcomings, things like that. So I think that if you are personal credibility in the audio format goes a long way toward establishing a bond between the listener and the audience, especially when you are explicitly partisan, as they are. There's a little extra of a bar to clear to gain a listener's trust. So yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
All right. Excellent Bulworth name check there. That was very good. So I guess the last thing I have time to ask you about, I mean, arguably one of the most influential podcasters, certainly the one with the biggest audience, is the guy who at least started out making the claim that he didn't really have a set of conventional politics. And that's Joe Rogan. His whole vibe was, I don't know, I'm not necessarily in anybody's pocket right now. This has really morphed quite a bit recently. I mean, he's totally in the Trump camp. And you wonder about that because when we're studying political podcasts, we don't study Rogan. On the other hand, right, he may have more traction than a lot of the people that we do talk about. We've only got about 2 minutes left, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Yeah, sure. I'll just address that quickly. I mean, Rogan is in an interesting space because you're right. He's not pitched explicitly as a political podcaster, but he has tremendous influence. There's a great article in The Atlantic by Devin Gordon a couple of years ago about this. I think that he has credibility with his audience. I do think that over the past couple of years, particularly since he's moved to Austin, I don't know whether that's connected or whether it's just a coincidence, but he has become much more kind of reflexively partisan. And I'm not super immersed in that subculture, but I have to wonder if it sort of turns off some of the people who are more in the funky kind of like stoner, just asking questions space of his fan base, which is not insignificant.
Yeah, I mean, Ad Fontes famously does this media bias chart, and they do a separate one for podcasts, and they typically have placed Rogan in the center, which doesn't seem as though it fits anymore. Hey, we're pretty much out of time here. I just want to first of all, thank you so much. I'd love to talk more podcasts to you. Thanks for telling me about Fifth Column. I'm going to keep listening to those guys. They're pretty interesting. But thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, you're welcome, Colin. Thanks.
All right. So Derek Robertson is a reporter, a writer, and producer at Politico, where he writes the Digital Future Daily newsletter. I also want to say, as we're sort of heading towards the end of the show here, if you're enjoying this coverage, we are going to try to do more of it. We're sort of in-house and maybe out-house, as they say. We're starting to call it Wake Me Up When November Ends. This is kind of a sub-brand of the Colin McEnroe Show, where we're going to be doing a lot more coverage tied to the election, maybe not the kind of coverage that more strictly political shows do. One of the things we're also going to do is make time to talk to one person for the full 49 minutes of our show, one person who has really interesting ways of analyzing or thinking about this election. So stay with us for that. I know we're going to have a Stan Herndon from the New York Times next week. We're excited about that. Okay, Bradley, you can start the music up if you'd like. So there are lots of different ways to lead and manage, but typically there's a type of manager who thinks that the job is to tell you what to do and where to go and how to get there and at what time. And there's another kind of manager who says, where are you going? Where is you want to go? And how can I help you get there? And for a really long time, Katie Tolarski has been that second kind of manager. Oh, I'm going to get choked up. So this is her last week with us. She was here when I got here 15 years ago. She was already here. She may have been here forever. I don't know. But so much has happened that wouldn't have happened without Katie. I don't think Audacious with Kyle and Wolf gets launched without Katie. I don't think Disrupted does either, but just going way, way back. She's very quietly, because she doesn't necessarily need the kind of attention that us talk show hosts need. She's just done amazing things. And sometimes the best manager, the greatest leader, is the person who saves you from the problem you didn't even know that you had, because she stops it before it gets to you. She's been that kind of manager too. I can't imagine life here without Katie Tolarski. She's doing this for all the best reasons. She just wants more time with her kids and with her husband for a while, and I totally endorse that. But I don't endorse having to come to work and not have Katie here. So that's all I really wanted to say. I think maybe our friend Dar Williams and Joan Baez can finish the show for me.
Was not mine to take. So our calf up her arm should be half what they are. I was breaking the laws that the sign makers need. And all I could eat was the poisonous apple. And that's not a story I was meant to survive. And I was all out of choices, but the woman of voices, she turned round the corner with music around her. She gave me the language that keeps me alive. She said, I'm so glad you finally made it here, with the things you know now that only time can tell. Looking back, seeing far, landing right where we are.